Okay, so in this video we're actually going to create a conversation with a user. So real quick, let's go to our Visual Studio, and in our create chat here we're going to create a function check conversation tab. We're going to receive a parameter, of course, receiver ID. Alright, so let's go back to our create chat in here, and we can just make this, we don't want to create separate list and styled list. So let's just put this outside, and then in here inside the list we're gonna create a wire click. Let's put that to check conversation. All right, it's actually there. And then here we're gonna add a parameter here in the end. I'll just add that, and then let's get this user ID. All right, close it and close with the bracket again. So when you click, we're gonna deliver the user ID to this create chat. So just to check that real quick, we're gonna and dump receiver ID. All right, so let's check that. Let's go back to our Chrome, refresh, and then if we click here, of course we have the usage of John, user 1, Cake, user 2, Game, user 3. So this is working perfectly. Now we're gonna actually use this receiver ID check for a conversation between the logged in user and the receiver ID that we received. So real quick, we're gonna create a conversation model. I'm gonna have to put the conversation model. So checked conversation, make the IC is capital in that, like that. So I'm gonna put conversation model where, okay, receiver ID is equals to auth user ID. All right, again, where sender ID is equals to this receiver ID there, like that. And then in here in the end, we're gonna type or where. So this is like an AND gate, logic gates, if you remember those. So we're gonna type or where. Now we're gonna check receiver ID. There, receiver ID is equals to, here we checked for the auth ID, now we're gonna check for the receiver ID itself, this one, like that. Type a $, like that, and also again where sender ID is equals to the auth user ID. So just copy this one, auth user ID there, paste it, and then here type get. Alright, so in here we're gonna have to just comment out that this is gonna check for the conversation, the receiver ID with the auth user ID. It's gonna check the sender ID with the receiver ID, or where the receiver ID, sender ID, auth user ID, and get. Right, so here we're gonna have to check if this check conversation, we can actually wrap this in a count. Copy that, type count. If the count is equals to 0, which means if there's no conversation existing, then let's just dump so you can track our work. No conversation. Alright, else, let's just make else if this same condition is greater than or equal to 1, and dump, or conversation exists. Alright, so this should let's just check to this point how things are working. Alright, let's go back to our Chrome and then click no conversation. Alright, no conversation, because we haven't actually created a conversation with these users here. So let's go back and actually create a conversation if it is 0. If it is 0, here created conversation create. Alright, make sure that's a capital C. Alright, we're gonna receiver ID is equals to this receiver ID, the one we've gotten from here, is equals to $that. Right, and then sender ID is equals to the authenticated user ID. I must create a class for this, a variable for that. I can't keep copying it. Alright, next we're going to need here a comma, and then we can now create a message for that. So on the top, we're gonna need to create a message for we're gonna create a message and add it to this conversation, the first message. So we're gonna make public message, make that to hello, how are you? Conversation created, and then next we're gonna have to create a message for that, and then add the message to the conversation. Created message. Here we're gonna make this to message create or an array conversation ID to created conversation ID, comma, sender ID, auth user ID, like that, comma, receiver ID is equals to this receiver ID, like that. Here's how the data is flowing from now. The receiver ID comes, we check for a conversation if it exists or not. If not, we're going to create the conversation between the two users, this receiver ID and the authenticated user's ID. After creating the conversation, we're going to create a message, alright, by getting the conversation ID, linking this message to this conversation, and then we're going to update our conversation model. Right, so now we're going to use created conversation last time message. We're going to update this to created message created at created conversation save. Right, and then next, after saving it, we're going to die and dump now. Saved. Alright, so hopefully there's no error and everything works correct. Now we can go back to our Chrome, refresh, try to click join. Alright, constraint last time message into conversations receiver ID. Oh, that was not nullable in there, so the conversion was not created. Okay, so the error was here in the created conversation. So you're gonna come here in the end, you're gonna add the last time message there, last time message will be equals to, it just says 0, right, since it can't be nullable. And then we also forgot one more detail, adding the message to the message model here. We forgot to actually add a message, so all the messages were blank. So let's copy that. In the end here, add another array, comma, type body, and then equals to, write this message. Alright, so this should work fine, but we also have to do one more thing. We have to make it fillable. So go back to the app, go to models, then message. In here, we forgot to add body as fillable. Body. So right now, everything should work perfect. If you go back to our Chrome and then type John, saved. Alright, cake, saved. And then if I go back actually here to a create chat, and then if after the created conversation has been created, now I'm gonna try to die and dump the created message there, dd created message, so we can actually see the created message. So let's go back to our Chrome and then create a conversation with John here. So if you can see, now we have a message, conversation ID 13, sender ID 5, receiver ID 3, body, hello, how are you, updated that, created that, and the ID of the actual message. Alright, so this is it for this video, and I've created more users, so you can go and create more users that we're going to use for the next video.